So that brings us to the main event. And it's my pleasure to introduce Charles Knight. Charles is a native of Richmond, Virginia. He currently the curator of the military history at the North Carolina Museum of History in Charlotte.
Raleigh.
Worked at museums and historic sites in Virginia, Arizona, and North Carolina. You stayed down in the Sun Belt, didn't you?
Yep.
Because you don't want much in the cold. All right. Charlie's first book was Valley Thunder, The Battle of Newmarket in 2010. And he was a historical advisor for the 2014 film, Field of Lost Shoes. Battle of Newmarket. I know that. He's written numerous articles for magazines and journals, and he travels about the country giving presentations to groups like ours. And we're happy to have him here tonight. His current book is From Arlington to Appomattox, Robert E. Lee Civil War Day by Day. Now he's going to share some of what he learned in his research about General Lee, right?
Yep.
Okay, Charlie, my pleasure. Please take it around to Charlie.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everybody. Glad to be here in Chicago. Don't very often get up to this part of the country. So, like February. You know what better time to come up here to the Great Lakes, right? When y'all extended the invite, it was pick January or February. Well, does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? It's going to be a blizzard anyway. But that's my southern mind thinking. I'd see snow maybe 1 or 2 days a year. So, anyway. Tonight, going to be speaking a little bit about General Robert E. Lee and some of the little tidbits about Lee that I discovered in the research for my new book, From Arlington to Appomattox. How many of you folks are familiar with the Civil War Day by Day book by E.B. Long? I see a few hands going up. Okay, there's a few more hands going up. Yeah, for those of you that are not familiar with that book, it's a reference book type of thing where you literally pick any day of the year and there will be a paragraph that tells you what happened in every theater of the war, military, political, home front, all kinds of stuff on there for truly every day of the year. And that's what I've done here with Arlington to Appomattox. It's literally Lee day by day throughout the entire war. Dave Powell calls me, lovingly, of course, General Lee's stalker. And well, when you think about it, he's not wrong. So not the easiest thing to try and figure out, I can't remember what I did last week. So, trying to figure out, what somebody did every day for 4 years, 150 years ago was no small undertaking. I normally split this talk into two halves, well, not necessarily equal halves, but the first part talk a little bit about some of the sources. Where do we go to find information about Lee that's relatively obscure, and then for the second part, actually go through and point out some of the more interesting episodes that involve Lee throughout the war. So to get started here. When you think about Lee, I know a lot of folks, will roll their eyes. Oh, great, another Lee book, another Gettysburg book, another Chickamauga book. That's the last damn thing we need is more Chickamauga stuff. But no, it's what can still be out there left to write about, about Lee? Well, turns out quite a bit. Here we go. Well, I think for most of us, for me anyway, first introduction to the general was probably through this guy's work right here, Douglas Freeman. He spent decades of his life researching and writing about Robert E. Lee, culminating in his 4-volume Pulitzer Prize-winning biography here of the general. It came out in the 30s. It was not the only thing, of course, that he wrote about Lee. He did the 3-volume Lee's Lieutenants. He edited several volumes, Lee's papers. He wrote some smaller works about Lee. So it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to say that Douglas Freeman knew more about Lee than probably anybody else alive then or since. And when you look at what Freeman did and you think about the fact that he did it in a pre-internet era, it's amazing some of the stuff that he was able to uncover. And of course, he had the benefit that we don't today of actually talking to veterans. He actually got to speak and correspond with a few of Lee's staff officers when he was working on this book, and would love to have been a fly on the wall for those conversations. In my opinion, take it for what it's worth, Freeman's 4-volume is still the most comprehensive look of the general. The biggest fault of Freeman is he kind of fell victim to hero worship. If you try to find anything negative about Lee, Freeman didn't write about it for the most part. But as you dig more and more into Lee's life, especially reading what his inner circle, his staff officers had to say about him, he was not the easiest person to work for or to get along with. And I'll give you a few examples of that as we go through the evening. Now, Lee never wrote his memoirs. He didn't keep a diary, so that makes writing about him, a little bit more complicated. So, where do we turn? To those that were close to him. Of course, I used some of his letters, but primarily looking at what his staff officers and some of his chief lieutenants had to say about him, as well as correspondence between him and his family members. Now, this is where Lee was writing to a cousin shortly before his death in 1870. He did want to write his memoirs. He wanted to write a history of the war, and it would have been definitely a very valuable source. It would have explained, in a lot of instances, what he was thinking, why he made some of the decisions that he did. Only downside is it probably would have been one of the most boring books ever written. The man, for all of his gifts, for all of his skills, for all of his talents, writing was not one of them. When you read the stuff that he actually put out there for public consumption, it will put you to sleep in a heartbeat. He and his brother edited their father's Revolutionary War memoirs, and Lee wrote the introduction to it. My God, it is dry and boring. So even if he's writing about his own exploits during the Civil War, I can't, it would not rank right up there with, I don't think, with some of the greatest Civil War literature. Speaking of which, John Gordon, one of the greatest American novelists ever. He thought, as you can see, it was a great loss to history that General Lee did not write his own recollections as General Grant did. Well, of course, Gordon's is one of the best Civil War memoirs out there. Only problem is it existed primarily in his head. Very little of it is actually based in fact. But Gordon had a spectacular way of writing, as did Grant, who, as we know, was aided by Mark Twain in writing his memoirs. But Gordon, Grant, Chamberlain, Porter, Alexander, those are some of the best written Civil War memoirs out there. And Lee just, like I said, that was not where his strong suit was. So, like I said, we turn to his inner circle. One of those was this guy right here, Charles Marshall. Might not be a familiar name to you, but I guarantee you're familiar with some of his work. How many of you are familiar with Lee's farewell order at Appomattox? Quite a few hands coming up. Lee did not write that. Charles Marshall did. If you ever get really bored and sit down and read the official records and you're reading Lee's battle and campaign reports, he didn't write those. Charles Marshall did. If you get really bored and you're interested in legal stuff, looking at you, John Horn, and you read the Confederate Conscription Act, guess who wrote that? Charles Marshall. So Marshall, he's pretty invisible from a public point of view, but he's very important on what's going on around Lee. He served as his military secretary for more than half of the war. Shortly after Lee died, Lee's eldest son, Custis, asked Marshall to write a very short biography of the general that was going to be published by Washington College. And Marshall declined to do it for a couple of reasons. One, he didn't think he had enough time to produce anything that would do justice to the general. And also, he didn't think, 5 or 6 pages or whatever was enough space. So he declined to do it. William Pendleton eventually did. But this was Marshall writing to one of Lee's cousins explaining why he didn't do it. And it's interesting. Marshall is a lawyer by trade, but when you read this, you can tell he had a historian's mind. The author should have access to the most authentic proof of all that he may state, and he should have ample time to collect all facts, and he should omit nothing that bears upon the subject. I had not then, nor have I now, the means of writing the more extensive work, though I'm using every means to prepare myself at some future time to do so. This is where it gets important. I'm preparing a life of the general, which I hope to present within a year or 18 months, provided I can get the materials. If I can do no more, I shall collect all that I can and write all that I know to be used by some future biographer. And in the end, that's what wound up happening. Marshall died before he finished his own memoirs or his contemplated history, biography rather, of General Lee. And his memoirs, incomplete as they were, remained in the family for several decades. They finally resurfaced in the 1920s, and I'll revisit that in just a second here. I want to talk about some of the other staff officers first. Change. There we go. This guy here, Walter Taylor. He was Lee's longest serving aide. He will join Lee the first week of May. So he's with him for all but the first roughly 2.5 weeks of the war. He's there from beginning of May all the way through Appomattox. Nobody would serve on Lee's staff longer than Walter Taylor, and Taylor probably got to know Lee better than anybody else during the war. Taylor, he's a VMI guy. He's a banker before the war in Norfolk, Virginia. He's in his mid-20s at this point. Very sharp young guy, very numbers oriented, probably why he worked as a banker. And Taylor would write 2 books about his Civil War experiences. They're supposed to be about Lee, but they didn't really get into the detail that the publisher wanted. But Taylor's best contributions, looking at it from a historian's point of view, were his letters. He would write to his fiancée, Betty Saunders, at least 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Very detail oriented, explaining, what he's doing, what Lee's doing, what's going on at headquarters. And it's a gold mine from a historian's point of view. Only problem is his letters from 1861 and the first half of 1862 do not exist. When his fiancée got them, she would read them and then destroyed them. And when Taylor found out about this, he was just extremely distraught. And he wrote to her pleading, please don't destroy my letters. I'm writing these not just to keep you informed. I'm writing them so I have a record of what I'm doing during the war. These are just as much for me as they are for you. So please don't destroy them. And from that point on, she kept them all. But unfortunately, the man who was closest to Lee, and in some cases, the only person who was with Lee at times during 1861, we don't have a record of what was going on. And when you read Taylor's memoirs that he would write after the war, it's very clear that he was referring back to those letters. In some cases, it's verbatim what he wrote during the war. Here's a picture of Taylor right at the beginning of the war. Now, Taylor, he was probably one of the most descriptive of Lee's aides. Lee went through a number of aides during the year. He had about 4 or 5 guys that stayed with him long term, but he had several others that would serve on his staff during the war. And a common theme was how difficult it was to work for Lee. He overworked his staff. He didn't show appreciation for them. He needed a larger staff. And just about every one of these guys, if they didn't leave the staff, they seriously considered it at least once during the war. And Taylor, when he was writing to Betty, he didn't hold anything back. If he was mad at Lee, he told her he was mad at her and explained why. And he had all kinds of nicknames for the general: the old man, the tycoon, several others. Probably didn't call him that to his face, but he didn't hold back when he was writing to his fiancée. However, his 2 books that came out, first one in 1877, the second one in 1906. He doesn't have anything bad at all to say about the general in there. None of the staff officers had anything bad to say about Lee when they were putting stuff out there for publication. He was their boss. He held a special place in their memories, and especially after his death, they weren't going to say anything bad about him. When they're writing to their family or to each other, that's a different story. Reading some of the correspondence after the war between the various staff officers, yeah, there's some that'll open your eyes a little bit. Some of the things they had to say about Lee. But just to move on here from Taylor, a lot of his letters were published in the mid 90s. Not all of his papers. None of the post-war stuff was included. It was just most of the wartime stuff was published in the 90s. So there's 3 published sources from Taylor that are out there for researchers. Taylor was the one who wrote the most, but he was not the only one to write about Lee. Armistead Long, he was Lee's military secretary before Charles Marshall. He joins Lee in November of 1861, so he fills in a little bit of the gap that's missing in Walter Taylor's stuff there, and he would serve through mid 1863. He wrote a huge book about yay thick. He actually went blind while he was writing it, and it's interesting. The manuscript and his letters are at UNC, and you can see his eyesight. You can just see progressively how bad his eyesight was failing, and when you see how bad his handwriting is. But anyway, like I say, he fills in a lot of the early war gaps there from Taylor. Fitz Lee, the general's nephew. His biggest claim to fame after the war was that his last name was Lee, and he wanted to be governor of Virginia, and he hated Billy Mahone, so that was pretty much his platform. Vote for me, my name is Lee, and I'm not Billy Mahone. But another part of that was he wrote a biography of his uncle, here again, really just for the purpose of keeping his name out there and reminding people, hey, Robert E. Lee was my uncle. He doesn't really reveal a lot of new stuff in there, but it should be mentioned as one of the sources that's out there at the very least. Lee's youngest son, Rob Jr., around the turn of the century, he wrote his memoirs and included some correspondence, not just of his father's, but all sorts of family correspondence, some real good stuff in there. In a lot of cases, the originals of these letters don't exist. They may still be in the Lee family, who knows, but the only place that they're known to exist in some instances are in this book. Here again is Marshall. I told you we'd get back to him and his memoirs. There was a guy, a British general, Frederick Maurice, who wrote a biography of Lee that came out in the around 1920. I forget the exact date, but it was very popular on both sides of the Atlantic. And one of the people that read that was Charles Marshall's son. He was very impressed with Maurice's book, and he contacted him and said, explained who he is, and said, "Oh, I have my father's memoirs. Would you be interested in seeing them?" And of course, I'm sure Maurice's initial reaction would be like any historian who has just published a book and then is gifted this great source that would have totally changed what they just wrote. But after he got over that initial reaction, he said, "Oh, you're right. I'd like to see these." He reads it. "Yeah, this is great. The public needs to see this." And so he worked out a deal with the Marshall family, and Charles Marshall's memoirs would finally be put in print 1927, edited by General Maurice. Some of the other guys, Thomas Talcott up here at the left corner, or I guess that's the right corner. No, it's the left corner. He was the son of Lee's mentor, Andrew Talcott. When Lee first graduated West Point as a young engineer, Andrew Talcott really took him under his wing, taught him a lot of the ropes of the Corps of Engineers and how things were going to be in the Army. And so about 30 years later, Lee got the opportunity to return that favor. He offered Talcott's son, Thomas, a position on his staff. He would be with the general for about 2 years before he transferred over to command of an engineer regiment. He published a couple of articles, gave a few speeches after the war, offering some insight into things going on at headquarters. Giles Cook, there in the middle, he served most of the war with other folks, primarily with Bragg and Beauregard, but in late 1864, he transferred to Lee's staff. He kept a diary of the Petersburg campaign and the Appomattox campaign. He is probably the best source for what Lee is doing for the few days that the Army is there at Appomattox. And my favorite, over there on the far side of the screen, Charles Venable. He was a unique character. He was a college professor. He's definitely not a person that you would think would be a military type of guy, and with good reason. Venable, to put it succinctly, the man is a genius. He graduated college at, I believe, 15. He's a lawyer at 16. He's a college professor at 17. He teaches at Hampton-Sydney, UVA, University of South Carolina, University of Georgia, and then he will go back to UVA for decades after the war. The man was a brilliant mathematician. He got into astronomy after the war as well. Only problem is he doesn't have a filter. Y'all familiar with Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory? That's the parallel that I always like to draw. I think Charles Venable and Sheldon have a lot of qualities that they share. if something popped into Venable's mind, it came out of his mouth, regardless of whether it should or not. And that got him in trouble constantly with Lee. None of the other folks on the staff would tell Lee, none of them would be as blunt and as honest with them as Venable was, and that it got him in trouble quite a bit. There was several stretches during the war where Lee and Venable would not talk to each other for days just because they were so mad at each other. The reason I bring up Venable, he also wrote his memoirs after the war, did not finish them, and they have sat largely unused in his wife's papers at the University of Virginia archives. Very few people know they exist, but his stuff is an absolute gold mine. I mean, some of it is better than Taylor's stuff, and I'll refer back to those memoirs here in a couple of the incidents that I'll talk about here in a few minutes. But that's going to be my second next project. After I finish my Billy Mahone bio, I'm editing his memoirs and papers. And of course, Lee's own papers. Nobody can really offer up a better glimpse into what Lee was thinking at various times than Lee himself. And his papers are everywhere. I think there's probably every small town historical society across the country has at least one Robert E. Lee paper, be it wartime or post-war. Yeah, more of Lee's papers. Moving on. Okay. All right, now we'll jump into here to actually some of the stuff that Lee is doing during the war. And when we think of Robert E. Lee, most folks think of him as primarily the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. And rightfully so. That's what he did for 2/3 of the war. But he did have several other assignments prior to that really go unknown and largely overlooked. When he first resigns his commission in the United States Army in April of 1861, he takes command of Virginia's military forces. And it's not really a job that most folks would have been clamoring to get. He inherits pretty much chaos. The state, although it has militia units, they're not in the best of organizations. Some good, some not so good. A lot of the officers shouldn't be officers. You got all these raw volunteers pouring in. Lee has to take the volunteers and militia and somehow craft it into a capable fighting force that not only the troops know what they're doing, but that it needs to be well led. So he needs to come up with a good officer corps here. And the other part of that, Virginia didn't used to be the border between two hostile countries. It is now, so he has to fortify pretty much the Potomac River, the Chesapeake shores, and figure out what to do with the mountainous region out there, primarily what's now West Virginia, build up garrisons at the various strategic points. Again, this is a very, very, very important job. And for the first week or two of the war, he's doing it by himself. He doesn't have a staff. He will finally get a staff officer after about a week and a half on the job. But for the first few days of his role here, he's doing things by himself. He's handling things that the commanding general has no business doing himself. And it keeps him busy, 12, 14, 15, 16-hour days. So busy that he didn't really have a lot of time to write about what he was doing during this time, other than complain about how busy he was. But his door is pretty much, a revolving door of politicians coming in. The governor of Virginia, he's meeting with him on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day. Once the Confederate government moves to Richmond, they're added into the picture. He's got family members, distant cousins that he didn't know that he had, that all of a sudden want commissions and a chance to serve on his staff. And that's one thing to his credit. Even though he needs a staff, he tells these distant cousins point blank, I need people that know what they're doing. I'm not bringing you on just because we're related. I can't bring you up to speed. I need somebody that's already up to speed on how to do this. And he's also got people coming in that are, trying to get out of the Army, people that are trying to get government contracts and whatnot. Again, he's so busy during this time period that he did not have enough time to adequately describe it. But he will leave Richmond 3 times during his time as the commander of Virginia's forces. First time's in mid-May. Goes down the James River to Norfolk on an inspection of the defenses down there. Of course, that's where Gosport Navy Yard is located across the river in Portsmouth. He will take a look at that. At the end of the month, he will go up to Northern Virginia, inspect the defenses around Manassas and Centerville. And then the following month, he goes back down the James to Jamestown Island, Williamsburg, Yorktown, and that area. On all three of these inspection tours, does not like what he finds. There will be a change in command after every one of these. This is where we see Beauregard come into play at Manassas. It's where we see John Magruder on the peninsula come from, and it's eventually why we see Benjamin Huger down there in Norfolk. All three of these places were originally commanded by senior militia officers. Most of them are unknown to Lee. And because they're unknown, he doesn't know if they're worth it. He needs people that he at least knows or knows of, and that he thinks he can work with and can trust. So you'll see a lot of replacements here going on during this time period. By the end of July, he's got things pretty much squared away along the Potomac and down in Eastern Virginia, and he will be sent personally out to what is now West Virginia to try and sort out some of the chaos out there. West Virginia exists today because it was not a very pro-secession, pro-Southern region, so they were having some difficulties with troops out there, and so Lee goes to take command out there. The weather was probably a bigger enemy to him out there than the Federals were. It's raining for all but about a week and a half of the 2+ months that he's out there. It actually snows in August. That's probably the norm here, but back in Virginia, it's not. He just can't figure out how to adequately get at the Federals that are encamped in a place called Cheat Mountain. And once he finally does, the second week of September, he's finally ready to launch an attack. The attack winds up not happening because his commanders were incompetent and didn't follow their orders. So this attack, it never happens. But while he has the army still there, he wants to try and do as much damage to the Federals as he can. And so he sends out one of his staff officers. And I need to back up. I forgot to mention, when Lee leaves Richmond, it's Lee, Walter Taylor, and this guy, John Washington. That's it. They will be the only ones that go. The three of them are sharing a tent, and that tent is not just their living quarters, it's their office, it's their eating space. So they got to know each other really well during this time period, probably more so than they wanted to. On the morning of September 13th, 1861, Lee will send John Washington out on a reconnaissance, sends him up this little creek valley to see if it's an adequate avenue of approach to get at the Federals on Cheat Mountain. And Washington rides into an ambush, gets himself killed. He's shot like 7 or 8 times. He's dead before he hits the ground. And Lee's son Rooney was with him, and he will just barely escape and bring word back to his father that Washington has been killed. And I bring this up because if you read Lee's responses if you read the correspondence, the letters that he writes in the immediate aftermath of this, it is quite evident that September 13th, 1861 is the day that the war hit home for Robert E. Lee. It was not when he resigned his commission. It was not when he sent off that emotional letter to Winfield Scott. It's not when he is forced to give up Arlington. It's not anything, you name it. It's not that. It's not the first conflict. It is September 13th, the death of his distant cousin, John Washington, and his close friend by this point, John Washington. This is an excerpt. There's Washington himself right there. And Washington is actually, I think he's the great grandnephew of George Washington. He was the last owner of Mount Vernon. He's the one that sold it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. The two of them were distantly related. And this is an excerpt of the letter that Lee sends to Washington's daughter the next day. And if you read the entire letter, it's in the archives at Washington and Lee, you can just see the range of emotions that Lee is experiencing while he's reading this. He goes from upset and sad to just absolute, fury. There are some portions of this letter where, you can just, you can sense that his blood is boiling with rage at what has happened. And then back to deep despair. It's an emotional range that I've never seen in any other letter that Lee has written. He does not display this type of emotion when his daughter dies, when his sister dies. This event was special in the events that happened to Lee during the war. I'm not going to read that to you, but in the interest of time. But actually, let me back up. One final note about this that reinforces how much the loss of Washington affected Lee. Just before Washington was killed, he sent back a note by courier to Lee. It said, yes, whatever the name of this creek is, this is a good avenue to get at the Federals. And it was just a small little note like this. And when Lee got it, after he got that right before, literally minutes before he found out that Washington had been killed. But when he undoubtedly read this little note from Washington again, he realized, this is the last thing this man ever did before he was killed. So he flipped it over on the back, wrote a little notation there on the back, said, this is the last note I ever received from John Washington. He kept it in his personal stuff, with the letters from the rest of his family, all the way through the rest of the war. And then a few weeks after Appomattox, he sent that to Louisa Washington, Washington's daughter, with this drawn out 2-page emotional note, again, explaining, the circumstances of this. And he was still affected by the loss of his friend 4 years later by that. So again, I'll stand by that statement. September 13th, 1861, that's the day the war hit home for Lee. And then this is kind of the flip side of that. When you think about things that should be emotional for Lee, that fall, he sent down to command the South Atlantic coast, Georgia, South Carolina, part of Florida. And while he's down there, he visits his father's grave, Light Horse Harry Lee, Revolutionary War commander under Washington. He was buried in Georgia, a place called Cumberland Island. This is the first time Lee's ever visited his father's grave. Even though he was stationed at Savannah right after West Point, he never went to visit his dad's grave. It's not until sometime in January of 1862. He didn't record the exact day. It's sometime a few days before January 18th, sometime that week. But he goes down there. He only mentions it in passing in a letter to his wife. So, you would think this would be an important moment for him, but it's really not. After that, he's called to Richmond to take over command of, let's start that whole sentence over. He's called to Richmond in March to become President Davis's military advisor. And Davis, he doesn't want a military advisor. Lee thinks he's going to be Secretary of War. Davis didn't want that. And Lee is put in a very awkward situation here. Where were we? Okay, yes, Lee going to Richmond. And he thinks he's going to be Secretary of War, but he instead becomes President Davis's military advisor. Davis, of course, is a West Pointer. He's commanded a regiment in Mexico. He's been Secretary of War prior to the war. He doesn't want a military advisor. He doesn't need a military advisor. He takes very seriously the role of being commander-in-chief. So Lee is in a very difficult situation here, and yet he manages to make it work, although he's completely out of the public eye. The public has no idea what Lee is doing at this time, and he's really, in the public's mind, really regarded as a failure by this point. But he comes in and he starts moving the pieces around the chessboard, not just in Virginia, but across the entire Confederacy. He's dealing with things at New Orleans. He's dealing with things back in Savannah and Charleston, as well as Virginia, and he makes it work. And this is the beginning of the working partnership, really, between Lee and Davis that works so well for most of the rest of the war. Davis will come to trust him. Davis will very seldom tell Lee no. That is, at least until they get to Petersburg. Lee will take command of the Army of Northern Virginia at the beginning of June of 1862, when Joe Johnston is wounded at Seven Pines. Lee and Davis were both there on the field when it happens. As they're riding back to Richmond, Davis will turn to Lee and say, you have temporary command of this army. Temporary, mind you. It was only supposed to be until Johnston was recovered from his wound. When Johnston comes back that November, he doesn't get his army back, and he was not too happy about that. But anyway, Lee does well with his army. He, of course, will drive McClellan away from Richmond during the 7 Days campaign, and then shifts the entire scene of war in Virginia into Northern Virginia. Now, I should point out here that Lee respected just about every opponent that he was up against during the war. McClellan, Meade had the utmost respect for the two of them. Burnside, everybody liked old Burnsy. You know, there's just something about him. He might not have been the sharpest tool in the shed, but he was a likable guy. Joe Hooker, Lee couldn't stand Hooker personally, but he respected his abilities as a commander. And then there is John Pope. Lee thought Pope was a war criminal. If he had had his way, he would have had him captured, brought to Richmond, and drawn up and quartered right there on Capitol Square, probably. So he was absolutely ecstatic when Stonewall gets the better of him at Cedar Mountain. And a few days after that, they will meet in combat at the old First Manassas battlefield there. And Lee has a couple of close calls. He's very nearly captured by Union cavalry as they're on the way towards Manassas. And then as soon as he arrives on the field, he's very nearly killed. The only witness to, or not the only witness to it, but the only one that wrote about it was my man, Charles Venable. This comes from Venable's memoirs, and this I will read to you. On reaching the field of Jackson's fight of the 28th, this would be around Groveton, Lee ordered his staff to remain at the edge of the woods out of sight of the enemy while he went forward on foot to Jackson's skirmish line and made his own observation of the condition on Jackson's right. This is something that Lee does very often. It's how he had really made a name for himself during the Mexican War, was going out doing his own personal recon. And he does it for the first half of the war. And this is what he's doing here. On his return to the edge of the woods, he remarked, "A sharpshooter came near killing me just now. We saw how near it was, as his cheek had been grazed by the bullet of the sharpshooter." So this is one of those deals where if Lee is, over here, the bullet misses him entirely. If he's over here, he's taking a bullet right between the eyes. So very close call, possibly the closest call that he has during the entire war. Nobody mentions it except for Venable. Oops, back up, getting ahead of myself here. Lee will win the fight there at Manassas. Longstreet will drive Pope off the field. Pope will be relieved of command, and Lee will move across the Potomac into Maryland. However, he does not do so as this, great conquering hero, that we probably envisioned, the great Roman ideal of a conquering hero riding at the head of his troops. No, a couple days after this incident right here, Traveler, Lee's horse, either falls on him or pulls him down. The accounts are conflicting, and Lee winds up breaking both of his wrists. And he really can't do anything. He has both of his arms in slings, so he looks like he's in a straitjacket. He's going around like this, and he can't feed himself, can't dress himself, can't ride. He can't do anything for himself. He can't get on a horse, so he's riding around in the back of an ambulance. It will not be until the end of October of '62 that he's able to even write his own name anymore. So he's for several days here, he actually has to be fed. Someone has to feed him. Truly, cut his food and put it in his mouth and feed him. To say that he was helpless and frustrated doesn't even begin to describe what he's experiencing here as the army goes into Maryland. They will lose at Sharpsburg, and here again, Venable is the only one to write this down. For the only time in the war, Lee orders his staff to fire on his own men, some of Longstreet's troops that are over on the right by Burnside's Bridge, when they break and are driven back in confusion. The only time during the war Lee ever told anybody to fire on their own men was there at Sharpsburg. What's the source? Venable. What's the only source? Venable. After Sharpsburg, Lee pulls the army back into the lower Shenandoah Valley around Martinsburg area to rest and refit. And while he's there, he learns that his daughter Annie has died suddenly in North Carolina. She and Lee's wife Mary, and I believe his other daughter Agnes was with them as well. They were staying at a resort in Warrenton, North Carolina, which is also the hometown of one Braxton Bragg. They were staying at a resort there, and Annie suddenly fell ill with what is believed to have been typhoid. She lingered for a few days, just in absolute agony, even though the doctors were constantly tending to her. They couldn't do anything for her. And she passed away there on October 20th of '62 and would be initially buried in the Jones family cemetery down there in Warrenton. And she was later moved, probably about 30 years ago, if that long. She was moved to Lexington with the rest of the family. But Walter Taylor happened to be an unwilling witness to Lee receiving the news of his daughter's death. This is what Taylor wrote about it. One morning, the mail was received. The private letters were distributed, as was the custom. No one knew whether any home news had been received by the general. At the usual hour, he summoned me to his presence to know if there were any matters of army routine upon which his judgment and action were desired. The papers containing a few such cases were presented to him, blah, blah, blah. I then left, but for some reason returned in a few moments, and with my accustomed freedom entered his tent without announcement or ceremony, when I was startled and shocked to see him overcome with grief, an open letter in his hands. That letter contained the sad intelligence of his daughter's death. And this is undoubtedly a scene that Taylor did not want to be witness to, but whatever it was that brought him back into that tent offered a great little tidbit here for historians and Lee biographers. Lee's three sons all happened to be with the Army at that point, and it fell to him to break the news of his sister, or of their sister's passing. That was not the first or the only personal tragedy to befall Lee in 1862. His first and only, up to that point, grandchild had died during the 7 Days campaign. I believe he was about 3 or 4 years old at the time. Died at the end of June of 62. Annie, as we've just seen, passed away in October of 62. And his second grandchild, this one was only a few weeks old, died in December of 1862. He was not able to make it to Richmond for the funeral of either one of his grandchildren. Speaking of his family, I could spend hours talking about the relationship here between Lee and Custis, but I'll just do it with this one slide here. Custis and his father had a special relationship that was different from the relationship Lee had with any of his other kids, probably because not only was Custis the oldest, he was really the sharpest of the bunch too. Custis, he would wind up being a major general by war's end. He is Jefferson Davis's top aide, so he's got his own thing going on. You know, he's not sitting over in a corner, waiting for something to do. But Lee would push a lot of things over for Custis to handle when it came to family matters, especially dealing with the girls, with his wife, with the schooling for the younger kids. Lee didn't have the time for that stuff, so he passed that all off to Custis to handle. And Custis was also Lee's sounding board. Whenever Lee thought it not proper to vent his spleen to the staff officers, if Custis wasn't there in person, he would write these long drawn-out letters to Custis complaining usually about either the quartermaster or the commissary or the Confederate government to Custis. And you get some great insight into what Lee is thinking, specifically his relationship with the commissary in Richmond comes out in these letters to Custis. And then there's his wife, Mary. She is your textbook spoiled rich girl. She never really could grasp the fact, one, that there's a war going on, two, that she's never going back to Arlington, and three, that that her husband is playing somewhat of a major role in this ongoing war. She was constantly writing to him complaining that he doesn't write to her enough. Well, Lee would tactfully tell her over and over this, you forget how much writing, talking, and thinking I have to do when you complain of the interval between my letters. There was usually about at least one letter a month where he's having to remind her, I've got other things going on. I can't constantly write to you. And so she's constantly harping on him about not writing enough. Another deal with Mary, after she leaves Arlington, she never not never. It takes her 3 years before she sets down roots somewhere. Instead of staying in Richmond somewhere or moving to stay with family, she just bounces around like a nomad, moving from place to place to place, wearing out her welcome pretty much at each place and then moving somewhere else, sometimes with relatives, sometimes with friends, sometimes with people they don't really know. And that was another thing that was causing Lee concern. A lot of times he didn't know where she was. And there were times when she would be too close to the front. She actually gets captured by the Union Army during the Peninsula Campaign. She and the girls wound up behind Union lines, not willingly. McClellan actually had to send her through Union lines in June of 62. And there was another point during the winter of 63, 64, Lee's army is on reduced rations. Okay, he can't get enough food to keep his own soldiers fed. He finds out that she's drawing army rations from the nearest quartermaster depot for her and the girls. So, Lee has literally just finished writing this complaint letter to Richmond. I need more food for my army. And he finds out Mary is taking what little bit of food there is for her own use. That's probably the only time that I can think of where you can actually see him lose his temper. And the letter to her was telling her that under no circumstances can she do that. And she would continue bouncing around until late 63, early 64. She would finally set up shop in Richmond. Lee's health will fail him in late spring of 63. He has what's probably a heart attack, a very severe heart attack, probably just about killed him. And he will be removed completely from the military scene here for about 2.5 week period here, late March, early April. The army is encamped at Fredericksburg at this point. Lee has to leave his headquarters, moves into this house, Thomas Yerby's house just south of Fredericksburg. And this fellow here, Lafayette Guild, he's the chief medical officer for Lee's army. He and his number 2 guy, Samuel Bemis over there, would be checking in on Lee multiple times a day. He would be put in this room right up here and confined to that room. The doctors would not let him leave. They told him that your job right now, sir, is to get well. Jackson can handle running the army for now. You need to get well. And they wouldn't even let any of the staff come over here with him. Normally Taylor or Marshall would come over once or twice a day just to brief him on the absolute important stuff. But he was not allowed to do anything related to the army during that time period. And he never recovers from this illness. He would constantly complain in letters to his family for the rest of the war. I still have not recovered from, he called it, my attack of the spring. And well, his health is one of the reasons why after Gettysburg, he submits his resignation to Jefferson Davis. He tells Davis, my health is failing me. And also, I don't think the army has any faith in me after that whole Gettysburg debacle. But Davis wisely did not accept Lee's resignation. But had he done so, this is one of those big what ifs. I hate what if things. To me, it's stupid to think about what ifs because it didn't happen. So there's no point trying to figure it out because there's no way of knowing what would have happened. But this is one of those things where this is a worthwhile what if. What if Davis had accepted his resignation? Who would have gotten the Army of Northern Virginia? Johnston, Beauregard, Longstreet, who knows? If you believe Billy Mahone, he would have gotten the Army, but no, he wouldn't have. That fall, the Army goes into winter quarters outside of Orange Courthouse, and Lee, against his doctor's orders, will be in his tent. He will spend the entire winter under canvas. So why is there a picture of this house on the screen if Lee's not there? Good question. Glad you asked. Lee's headquarters is actually, where's the pointer on this thing? Is that the pointer? Yeah. Lee's headquarters would be right about here on that hillside back there behind that house. President Davis comes to visit the Army in the latter half of November. Morale was kind of sagging at this point, so Davis thought if he came out there, reviewed the Army, and gave some lengthy speeches, that most of the troops would sleep through, it would somehow boost morale. And it seemed like a good idea. And so when he shows up by rail out there, he moves in to this house right here, a little place called Bloomsbury. It's one of the oldest houses in Orange County. And Lee, like I said, is right over here, about half a mile, 3/4 of a mile distant. And so every morning, Lee would ride over here, retrieve Davis, and rather than meet here in this nice house, they would come back over here to Lee's tent and meet under canvas in the rain, because it rains the whole time that Davis is there. So all of these plans that he had don't happen. The weather will not allow a review. It will not allow speeches. He goes up to the top of Clark's Mountain to try and see the Union Army, but because of the clouds and the rain, he really can't see them. And so after 3 days, he gives up, goes back to Richmond. About the time he gets back to Richmond, the Army of the Potomac goes on the offensive, the Mine Run campaign. So Davis just missed a chance to be there during active operations. Lee was probably thanking his lucky stars that Davis was not there during active operations, looking over his shoulder. But Lee winds up going to Richmond to meet with Davis again soon thereafter. And Dave, you probably know a little bit about this. What happens in late November of 63?
This happened
Yeah, there was that mishap in Chattanooga. Bragg got his butt kicked out there in Chattanooga, and Davis finally realized that the time had come to relieve Braxton Bragg from command. And so he summons Lee to Richmond. Why? Because he wants Lee to replace Bragg at the head of the Army of Tennessee. And Lee, he's convinced this is going to happen. When one of the last people that he sees on his way out of Orange is Jeb Stuart, he tells Jeb Stuart, I don't think I'm coming back. I think this is actually going to happen. And when he gets to Richmond, he and Davis and the Secretary of War will spend days, literally days, behind closed doors discussing what to do about the Army of Tennessee. This is probably the biggest miracle that Lee ever does. You forget about the stuff he does on a battlefield. To me, this is the biggest, wow, how did he do that moment of his entire career during the war. Not only does he change Davis's mind about sending him to Georgia to take command of the Army of Tennessee, he convinces Davis to put Joe Johnston in command of the Army of Tennessee. Who does Davis hate more than anybody else on the planet? Joe Johnston. So Lee, he's pulled a double miracle here at this point by having Johnston put in command. So that means, of course, Lee will stay in Virginia. When those meetings are done, it's almost Christmas. And by this point, Mary and the girls they've set up shop in a house there on Franklin Street. Custis is living there with them as well, just a couple blocks from the state capitol. And most people would say, it's almost Christmas. Why don't I stay here with my family in this nice warm house and spend Christmas with my family? Instead, Lee does really the Lee thing is the only way I know how to describe it. He goes back to Orange to be with his men. And about the time that he gets there, he finds out that his daughter-in-law, Charlotte, whom even though they weren't blood relatives, he loved Charlotte just like as though she were his own daughter, that she died on the day after Christmas. And that one is another one that really hit him hard. And what made this even worse, Charlotte had already lost her only two children. She was probably suffering from postpartum depression after the death of the second one, and she also had some health issues as well from that pregnancy and birth. And on top of that, in June of '63, Charlotte had been at her parents' house with her wounded husband Rooney. He'd been wounded at Brandy Station. Yankee Cavalry Patrol comes up to the house, takes Rooney out of his sickbed, hauls him off to prison. Charlotte witnessed this happening. So, she was already in poor health to begin with, and watching her husband get carted away, then the death of their child. Charlotte was really broken by this point, and her health it finally just, it couldn't recover. She dies the day after Christmas. Then we'll fast forward quite a bit here to the Oberlin campaign. We were talking earlier about the North Anna. That's where this takes place. This would be the latter half of May. Lee has fallen out of the wilderness. He's been pushed back from Spotsylvania. He's taking up a defensive position at the North Anna River. And as his troops are getting into position, he comes up to this house. It's still there. It's owned by the Civil War Trust today. This is the Fox House, a place called Ellington. And Lee is out here in the front yard of the house. It's a good position. It's on a bluff overlooking the river. He can see his own troops deploying. He can see the Federals as they're approaching on the other side of the river. And inside the house there, Mr. Fox looks out the window and says, oh, that's General Lee. Oh, I need to go out there. And so Fox goes out there and tells Lee, General, I'd love it if you would come in and have breakfast with my family and I. And Lee very gracefully says, I appreciate the offer. No, thank you, sir. We're not going to be here that long. But then Lee can immediately tell that he's hurt Fox's feelings. And so he tells Fox, but if you have some buttermilk, my staff and I would love some. That was Lee's favorite drink. He would take buttermilk before anything else. And so Fox goes, oh, yes, sir. Goes back into the house, comes back a minute or two later with a pitcher of buttermilk. Lee has gone up onto the porch at this point, talking to Fox, and a Union battery is set up on the far side of the river. They can see this gaggle of officers over here. I'm sure they didn't know who they were, but there was a tempting target anyway. So they throw a couple of shells downrange. One of them passes a few feet of Lee and slams into the side of the door frame there on the porch. It was either a solid shot or a dud because it didn't explode, but that's yet another close call for Lee. And remember, this is after he's tried to lead the Texas Brigade at the Tap Farm at the Wilderness. He's tried to lead 2, maybe 3 attacks at Spotsylvania. So he's really getting closer to the front and really being more exposed here during May than he is normally during the war. So not only does that shell almost take him out, this is something I can't prove, but I think there's good circumstantial evidence for this. I think he gets food poisoning. I think this buttermilk was spoiled because that afternoon he's suffering from horrible, horrible stomach ailments. He can't ride his horse. He has to be carted around in the back of an ambulance. And then whatever that is triggers other stuff, and it just kind of snowballs on him. So within about 36 hours of this, he's confined to his cot. He can't even get out of bed. And it really leaves the army leaderless. Longstreet has been wounded in the Wilderness. Ewell is having some kind of mental breakdown. He's not on the scene at this point. A.P. Hill is having a flare up of whatever it is that he caught at West Point. So he's out of the picture. Jeb Stuart is dead. There's no senior leadership in the Army of Northern Virginia at this point. Early and Anderson are too new at this. They can't take command of the Army. The North Anna is the one time that Lee has where he could actually turn back Grant's assault and push him back northward. There's nobody to lead the army. Lee is sick at this point, and Venable, bless him, comes into Lee's tent at this point and tells him, look, old man, probably told him that to his face. Look, old man, we need somebody to command the army. You have to send to Richmond and have them send Beauregard up here. Well, Lee didn't see it that way. So the two of them got into a little spat over that. Lee threw him out of the tent, didn't speak to him for a couple of days after that. But Venable was right. You know, they needed Beauregard or somebody, Davis himself, somebody needed to come up from Richmond and take command of the army. But this Lee would not do it. And this golden opportunity passes him by. And it's not until I believe around June 5th, June 6th, I think is when he finally is over whatever this was. He was, after he leaves here, he's still confined to his bed for days after this. Then we'll fast forward again quite a bit here. This is the best example I could find of Lee's temper. Lee had a bad temper. When he was mad, it was best to stay out of his way. You can ask Charles Venable about that. This would be about a week after the capture of Fort Harrison, one of the forts east of Richmond. Lee is organizing a counterattack to go try and reclaim the fort. And there's a couple of division commanders involved. Porter Alexander is going to be in charge of the artillery. Alexander goes on for about 2 pages about this in his memoirs. And the night before the attack, Lee, of course, has all the concerned commanders together at headquarters. They go over the plan, and as they're breaking up, Lee says, "All right, I'm going to leave my headquarters at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 a.m., 1-2. So I want you to be ready to fall in, join me as I go by your headquarters. Again, I'm leaving headquarters at 2 o'clock. So shortly after midnight, he gets up at 1 o'clock and is mad that no one is ready. Why? Because it's 1 o'clock, not 2 o'clock, like he told everybody. There's no, the horses are not ready. There's no breakfast. There's no coffee. Most of the staff is still asleep. He's livid. And he doesn't understand that he's an hour early. And he takes it out on everybody that he finds. I believe the first target of his ire that morning was Walter Taylor, but Venable and Alexander wind up getting the worst of it here. When Lee rides off after headquarters, he probably had to finish saddling Traveler or whoever he was riding that day by himself. None of the staff was ready to go with him. They all had to chase after him down the road. He gets down to Alexander's headquarters. Alexander is not there at the roadside like he had said. So he's, getting madder and madder as the minutes tick by. He sends Venable over. Venable had caught up with him by this point. Sends Venable over to go get Alexander. The two of them are chatting for a while, and it goes from bad to worse here. Venable, or Lee rather, tells Venable to do something. Venable doesn't hear him because he's talking to Alexander. Lee thinks Venable is ignoring him. So surprise, surprise, he doesn't talk to Venable for about a week afterwards. Alexander, is then the targets of Lee's hostility here at this point when Lee tells him, "Where's our guide?" "Well, you didn't tell me to get a guide." "Well, you should have had a guide." And, it's Alexander's just like, "What? I don't even know where we're going." And so, yeah, it just, you didn't want to be around Lee that morning. And Alexander goes on, like I say, for about 2 pages describing this. His mood improved once the battle got joined, except for Venable. They didn't speak for the better part of a week. That attack failed, by the way. Lee goes back to Petersburg. During the siege, he has 3 different headquarters locations at Petersburg. The first one is at a place called Violet Bank. It's actually on the north bank of the Appomattox River, right across from the city. It's still there today. It's a museum run by the city. The second one is this place, and he had to move here because when the leaves fell off the trees, Union artillery could plainly see Violet Bank. Now that's kind of makes your headquarters location tenable when they can drop shells on you at will. So he moves into town. Walter Taylor chose this house, and he thinks he's hit the jackpot. It's a gorgeous house. It's furnished. Nobody is living there, he thinks. The church that Lee goes to, Grace Episcopal, is right across the street from it. It's got a huge open yard for the horses and the headquarters guard and everybody to set up there. So Taylor, he moves everything in. He sets up headquarters. And then right after everybody is settled in there, this young couple shows up at the front door, looking none too pleased. What are you doing in our house? And they explain, oh, well, General Lee has taken this as his headquarters. I'm sorry, we didn't think anybody lived here. We've just rented this house. We just got married. We rented this. This is our honeymoon house. And, oh, okay. Well, you'll have to go somewhere else because we're here now. And this new bridegroom, every day for the next several weeks would show up at the door, looking impatient, arms crossed, tapping his foot, why are you still here type of deal. And they were not going to vacate as long as Lee was there. Towards the end of the month, Lee goes to Richmond to meet with Davis. And that's when this guy realizes, now's my chance. He's not here. So he goes down there and confronts one of the staff, probably Taylor, just point blank demands, get out. You've had this place long enough, get out. And so Taylor and the rest of them pack everything up and they have to relocate. And they move here. William Turnbull's house, place called Edge Hill, out on the extreme western edge of Petersburg. Now, when Lee comes back on the evening train from Richmond, one of the staff, I don't remember which one it was, has to go meet him at the train station. And that was unusual because normally they don't do that. And it's like, oh, okay. What are you doing here? I need to escort you to your new headquarters, sir. What do you mean new headquarters? So as they're riding out to Edge Hill, it's explained to Lee what has happened, and Lee has a sense of humor. He thought it quite funny. And while this is going on, Taylor is over here at the Turnbull house setting up headquarters. I'm going to quote exactly what Taylor wrote about this. The only house available was one some 2 miles from town. So bag and baggage, we came to Edge Hill, and here I am finally fixed in the parlor with piano, sofas, lounges, pictures, rocking chair, etc. Everything as fine as possible for a winter campaign. After fixing the general and staff, I concluded that I would have to occupy one of the miserable little back rooms of the house, but Mr. Turnbull hinted that I might take the parlor, and this decided me. I believe the general was pleased with his room, and on entering mine remarked, you're finally fixed. Couldn't you find any other room? No, but this will do. I can make myself tolerably comfortable here. And Lee was struck dumb with amazement at my impudence and soon vanished. So Lee winds up, in this back corner, small room. Taylor has the finest room in the house for himself. He was quite proud of himself for this. And knowing Lee's sense of humor, he was probably not as irritated as he led on. This is one of those things where he probably had a little glint in his eye and was thinking, well played, young man, well played. But when Lee was describing this to Mary, those are the only 2 accounts of this, Taylor's and Lee's. Lee goes into a little bit more detail about the quarters that Taylor assigned to him. In this small little bedroom, the door to the bedroom doesn't close. And so at night, all of the Turnbull cats and dogs come in there because that's the only fireplace they can get to. So Lee goes to bed surrounded by all these animals that are trying to keep warm. Edge Hill does not survive the fall of Petersburg. Lee was there on the morning of April 2nd. He's meeting with Longstreet. A.P. Hill will eventually join them that morning. They're discussing probably how the army is going to get away from Petersburg on their own terms before Grant drives them away. Well, unfortunately, April 2nd is the day that Grant is going to force them to relocate from Petersburg. And As they're meeting that morning before dawn, Marshall bursts into the room, announces that Hill's lines have been broken south of town. Hill doesn't wait for much of an explanation. He runs out the door, gets on his horse, makes it about 2 miles up the road, and gets himself killed when he rides into federal lines. And that's just the beginning of bad things here that's going to befall the Army of Northern Virginia that morning. This is probably a little bit more than a mile away from Fort Gregg, and its companion, Fort Whitworth, is even closer. You can actually, well, back then you could actually see Fort Whitworth from Edge Hill. So the fighting is going to come very, very close as the Union Army moves through that breakthrough and does a wheel to the right and starts pivoting up to try and turn Lee's, what's left of Lee's flank. And Edge Hill becomes the front lines. There will be a battery of artillery that drops trail right there in the front yard. As you can see from the sketch, the house burns. They were not able to get much out of there. By then, the headquarters had been evacuated. Most of their stuff was gone. Lee had moved closer to town by that point. But as things are falling apart around him, he realizes his daughter Agnes is still in Petersburg. She had come down a couple of days prior to see her father, and she was not able to meet with him because Sheridan had his own little thing going on down there at Dinwiddie Courthouse in Five Forks. So that kept Lee occupied. So they were never able to connect up. Lee assumed she had gone back to Richmond. She had not done so. She's still in Petersburg staying with friends. When Lee realizes this, he turns to the nearest officer he can find, says, "Go find my daughter, get her out of here while you still can." And so somehow this guy manages to find Agnes. The two of them get on a train. It's the very last train that leaves Petersburg that day. They make it back to Richmond. She gets back to the house on Franklin Street just in time for the evacuation fire. So, you know, literally went from the deteriorating situation there at Petersburg right into the evacuation fire at Petersburg, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. Lee does somehow manage to stabilize his lines. He knows he's going to have to give up Petersburg, but he's managed to save what's left of his army. The surrender is not going to happen in Petersburg. So while he's making the final arrangements to get the army across the river and into Chesterfield County, Walter Taylor approaches him and has an interesting proposal. Lee has been in a bad mood ever since Marshall told him that morning about the lines being broken. Everybody that encounters him that day comments on, how, what a vile mood he's in that day, which is quite understandable given everything that's going on. But Taylor gets up the guts to him to come up to him and say, "General, I'd like to go to Richmond. Betty and I would like to get married." And surprisingly, Lee agrees to it. And so Taylor rides off to Richmond, and as the city is burning around him, he and Betty get married. And Lee told him, "Okay, you can go, but you gotta be back here tomorrow morning." So Taylor rejoins the army as they're moving through Chesterfield County on a march that will take them ultimately to Appomattox Courthouse a week later. And that is where Lee will surrender the Army of Northern Virginia on April 9th. He will stay at Appomattox for the next 3 days. Marshall writes the farewell order for the Army. Officers that Lee knew from the Union Army, including all the way up to George Meade, will come over and visit him. They're able to pass freely through the lines at this point. He will come over and visit Lee for a time during the post-surrender signing there. Lee will leave on the morning of the 12th. Takes him 3 days to get back to Richmond. And word of his arrival has preceded him as he's crossing the pontoon bridge into Richmond on the morning of April 15th. A huge crowd turns out lining the streets just to see him as he goes by, and he will disappear behind the doors of the residence there at 707 Franklin Street. And at that point, Lee's war is over. Now, as a bit of a postscript here, I mentioned a couple times, about how difficult Lee made life for his staff officers, for his inner circle. And one of the questions that folks usually ask is, well, what did they really think about him, after the war? There's two examples I can give you that really, I think, sum it up best. At Lee's funeral, when he's being laid to rest there in Lexington in October of 1870, Walter Taylor and Charles Marshall are invited by Custis to sit with the family in the very front pew there in the funeral there for the general in Lexington. And I think even better example than that is this is Walter Taylor's son, his gravesite, Robert Edward Lee Taylor. So I think by that point, they'd put everything behind them. They were on good terms, and they'd come to realize that they had been part of something special here. They'd been around a very unusual and historically important figure during that time period. So with that, I will be glad to take some questions if anybody has any. Questions from anybody except Mr. Powell, because I don't want to answer whatever nonsense he's going to come up with. Nobody? Yes.
Real quick, these aides, after he had his heart issues and things like that, did they talk about that, like during the Gettysburg campaign, and after did they write home about his health, his health? Did they disclose that to their, those letters to their families?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. Not as much as you would think. Taylor did. The others may have. Some of their correspondence from that time period doesn't exist. But yeah, it was definitely a concern, and they did take on a little bit more a role without him telling them to after that point, just because they could see that things were not going to be able to continue as they did, pre heart attack. But yeah, that's a good question.
Did they notice it in something like that? I mean, did they notice a difference in his?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was very apparent. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Did Lee push for the promotion of his staff officers? Because I know some of the other armies, the staff officers were generals, and they had a little bit higher rank than Colonel Marshall and Venable. Did he push for them for higher rank?
His hands were kind of tied a little bit as to what rank they were allowed by Congress. But you're right, McClellan had, all kinds of stars around him on his staff. And well, technically he did too, because of the way that the Confederate Army rank insignia was. But yeah, no, Congress would only initially allow his aides to be major and below. And they revised that later in the war. They allowed, I think, 3 of them to go up to lieutenant colonel, but that was as far as they went. But really, his hands were tied when it came to their rank. He did push for raises for them when he could, but that was pretty much tied to rank. And if they couldn't be promoted, they weren't going to get more. But no, that's an excellent question. Yes, sir.
Benchmarking studies done on the size of administrative staff, aides of staff with armies, Potomac and Virginia. And I guess it leads to the question, why was his staff so small? Was he a poor administrator? Did he lack those skills? You studied him. What are your thoughts?
There's a book. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it. Something like Gold Buttons and Buff Facings or something like that. That examines the staff, the Civil War staffs. And here again, like I was telling Bruce, his hands were really kind of tied as to Congress set the limits as to what each general officer was allowed. They could have more volunteer aides. And you some of these guys, you'd see them bring in these volunteer civilian non-paid guys. Lee didn't do that. Just his attitude, and this was reflected all the way back to the first weeks of the war. He didn't want large staffs for himself or for anybody else. He realized right from the beginning how limited the South was on manpower. He thought bloated staffs were a waste of that manpower. If somebody was capable of carrying a musket and serving at the front, that's what he wanted them doing. He didn't want to see these bloated staffs in the back. So yeah, he very, very seldom would he take on a volunteer staff officer. He pretty much kept it right at what he was allowed by law. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe an ignorant question, but you mentioned how you said how he like we like McClellan, he respected them. You didn't mention anything about Grant and Sheridan. Did he respect them, or is that like a stupid question?
No. You're good. You're good. He respected Grant as well, but there was, and it's not just with Lee, it was pretty much with everybody in the Eastern Theater. With Grant coming from the West, they looked down on these Western generals overall because they were up against guys like Braxton Bragg, so who's not going to win when you're up against Braxton Bragg, but yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was, it's a perfect example. Those are the second and third string guys out in the Western Theater. But no, once he actually got to see what Grant was doing, there was the same respect developed there as well. Not to the same degree that it did with McClellan and Meade, but it was there. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
wondering, knowing that some of his associates were at the funeral, was seated economically, did Lee socialize with his staff? You know, in the short time he lived after the war, did he meet with them on a social basis?
He did occasionally. He corresponded with them quite a bit, Taylor in particular. And when he was coming down to Norfolk, he came to Norfolk, I want to say 2, maybe 3 times after the war. He always stayed with Taylor when they came down there. I don't know that he ever saw Marshall after the war. Marshall lived in Baltimore. So I don't know that he ever got a chance to see him or visit him at home. Venable, I don't know that they ever saw each other. There was a few letters, but I don't think they saw each other in person after that. But the staff, they remained close among themselves. So if they kept each other informed about what was going on with Lee, but Taylor was the one that he really remained in touch with the most after the war. Anybody else? All righty. Thank you. Well, thank you.